My job tonight is pretty simple. I'm supposed to say nice things about David Blight and then get out of the way. I could talk about the David Blight that is brilliant at closing dives, that's wonderful at hanging out on beaches, but that's not the Dave we're going to talk about tonight. Today we're going to talk about the David Blight who is the class of 1954 professor of American history at Yale, where he's taught since 2003. David has had a stellar career, being on the faculty of Amherst College at Harvard, and my favorite place, North Central College in scenic Naperville, Illinois, a place I really do like. As a gifted and prolific scholar, David's work has enriched the field of history and transformed our understanding of the intersection of memory and national identity, but especially when it comes to race and the American Civil War. Currently working on a major biography of Frederick Douglass, David's most recent book is American Oracle, The Civil War and the Civil Rights Era. His highly lauded work, A Slave No More, Two Men Who Escaped to Freedom, brilliantly expands our understanding of the self-emancipated. And clearly for many of us, his best-known work, Race and Reunion, The Civil War in American Memory, has been recognized as one of the most important books of the last two generations. But as impressive as his scholarship is, and it really is quite amazing, I think his leadership in the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition is equally important. As somebody who has spent most of my career in the field of public history, I am so impressed with David's ability through the center to make difficult but crucially important history accessible to a broad public. In some ways, David's work at the center, in addition to stimulating new scholarship and making that accessible, his work ensures that students and teachers and scholars and really average folks find a useful and usable past, which is really difficult when it comes to many of the issues around race and memory. So tonight, David's talk is entitled From Days of Mourning to Days of Jubilee, Frederick Douglass and the Meaning of the Civil War. Please join me in welcoming someone who has made both the historical profession and, quite candidly, our nation better, David Blight.
My goodness, thank you, Lonnie. You have no idea how that feels to be introduced by Lonnie Bunch. Maybe you do. And Lonnie, thank you for doing that and taking the time to come tonight. And thank you also for supporting the Public History Institute we're doing at Yale. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is doing many, many, many things in this country, some of which you know about and some of which you don't. I want to thank Eleanor Harvey for inviting me here, and mostly I want to thank Eleanor for an hour ago or more, I had a transcendent, all too short personal tour of the exhibition on the Civil War and Art. She is the curator. If you haven't had any chance, if anyone in this audience hasn't had any chance to tag on with one of Eleanor's tours of that exhibit, beg or bribe your way into one. I wish I could actually stop and comment on some of the things I just saw. And when you see some of these paintings in person, as opposed to that catalog, they are an entirely different experience. I am going to talk about Mr. Douglass tonight. And I must say at the outset, I am still a bit of a novice at things like PowerPoint. But since I was coming to one of the great art museums in Washington, I figured I got to show some images. So I want to thank my friends Zoe Trod, John Stauffer, and Celeste Bernier, who are, as we speak, creating, curating, and writing a book that I think will be out within a couple of years on all of the photographs of Frederick Douglass. The three of them are the editors. And the images you'll see tonight, almost all the images you'll see tonight of Douglass come from their collection. And in case you don't know, which I don't think most people do, this book in creation right now of Douglass photographs has now shown that Frederick Douglass was the single most photographed American of the 19th century. I was stunned when I first heard that. More than Mark Twain, more than Abraham Lincoln, more than who knows who else. Twain lived into the 20th century, and I guess if you count the Twain photographs, he may outdistance Douglass. But having worked on Douglass, it seems like all of my life, it begins to not surprise me when I realize that he traveled so incessantly. He traveled all the time, when he was young, middle-aged, and old. And everywhere he went, it appears the local photographer wanted to take his photograph, and he was more than willing to sit for them. And sometimes, given his extraordinary vanity, would even ask the photographer to do a second one because he didn't quite like the profile of the first one. I want to begin, though, with I guess you could call it a literary reference to Douglass. It comes from one of the famous WPA narratives. The oral history is taken down in the 1930s, this one from 1937. It was an interview with a 91-year-old former slave whose name was Cornelius Garner. He was speaking to a black interviewer. And the interviewer at one point asked Mr. Garner if he had fought in the Civil War. He's 91. And Garner replied to the interviewer, "Did I fight in the war? Well, if I hadn't, you wouldn't be sitting there writing today." And then Mr. Garner described the corner in his native Norfolk, Virginia, where slave auctions used to be conducted on New Year's Day. And he said to the interviewer, "That day, New Year's Day, should be kept by all the colored people. That is the day of freedom. And they ought to remember Frederick Douglass, too. Frederick Douglass told Abe Lincoln, 'Give the black man guns and let him fight.' And Abe Lincoln say, 'If I give him a gun, when he come to battle, he might run.' Frederick Douglass say, 'Try him, and you'll win the war.' And Abe said, 'All right, I'll try him.' Old man Garner got it, not entirely accurate, but who cares? It's one of the most beautiful and simple descriptions of that relationship, such as it was, that encounter, that both real and symbolic encounter between Douglass and Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War. I'm going to show you some artist depictions of that encounter from the 20th century at the very end of the lecture. But before we get to any pictures of that encounter, the meetings of Douglass and Lincoln, I wanted you to hear Gardner's memory of it. I also almost never lecture on Douglass without using my favorite Douglass poem, not a poem by Douglass, a poem about him. It turns out that almost every major African-American, and some white, but mostly African-American poets of the 20th century all wrote their Frederick Douglass poem. It was sort of a rite of passage. I think the greatest of them is Robert Hayden's. It's just one single verse. Hayden, the wonderful poet of the post-World War II era, who wrote so many historical poems. His Douglass poem goes like this, and there's so many meanings embedded in it if you hear the music of the words. When it is finally ours, this freedom, this liberty, this beautiful and terrible thing, needful to man as air, usable as earth, when it belongs at last to all, when it is truly instinct, brain matter, diastole, systole, reflex action, when it is finally won, when it is more than the gaudy mumbo-jumbo of politicians, this man, this Douglass, this former slave, this Negro beaten to his knees, exiled, visioning a world where none is lonely, none hunted, alien, this man, superb in love and logic, this man shall be remembered. Oh, not with statues' rhetoric, not with legends and poems and wreaths of bronze alone, but with the lives grown out of his life, the lives fleshing his dream of the beautiful, needful, terrible thing. What is the thing? Well, Hayden said not with statues rhetoric, but let's look at a statue for at least the next few minutes. I want to do two things with this talk tonight. Three things, I guess. One is to show some images of Douglass over time and a few artist depictions of him. But I also want to place us after the war to begin with, at the moment of one of his greatest speeches. I think it's one of his three greatest speeches. And then move back from there into the war and look at this question of what did the Civil War mean to Douglass? How did he interpret it? How did he explain it? Throughout the spring morning of April 14, 1876, a huge crowd, largely African American, began to assemble in the vicinity of 7th and K Streets in Washington, D.C. This is for a Washington audience. You know where these streets are. At least I suspect you do. Although some of you may drive these streets every day and not even know which street you're on if you're like me. It had been 11 Aprils since the end of the Civil War, and 11 years to the day since the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. A parade involving nearly every colored organization in the city, as the press put it, was about to step off at noon en route to the unveiling of an extraordinary monument to Lincoln. The city had witnessed many remarkable parades since the end of the war, but this one would be a first. The day was declared a public holiday in the Capitol. The flags above the United States Senate and the House of Representatives, as well as other government buildings, flew at half-mast. At the head of the procession rode a contingent of 27 mounted police, followed by 3 companies of colored troops, headed by the Philharmonic Band of Georgetown. Numerous other cornet bands, marching drum corps, youth clubs in colorful uniforms, and fraternal orders from both Washington and Baltimore filled in the long line with pride and pomp. The Knights of St. Augustine carried a large banner with a painting of the martyred Lincoln on it. Horse-drawn carriages carried, among others, the black Virginia freeborn professor and dean of the Howard University Law School, John Mercer Langston, who would perform as master of ceremonies and orator, and with him in the carriage was the orator of the day, the newly arrived resident of Washington, the famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Now, Douglass, of course, had grown up a slave just across Chesapeake Bay on the eastern shore of Maryland, and now had relocated to Washington, where he will live the rest of his life. Langston and Douglass were soon to become open political and personal rivals, really political enemies soon. But on this day, they joined in one of the most important public events of their lives. The route of the procession moved westward along K Street to 17th Street, then south a few blocks, and through the grounds of the Executive Mansion, what we call the White House, which then had no walled or fenced security, and onto Pennsylvania Avenue. The parade traveled eastward directly toward the Capitol building, turning briefly right on 1st Street West, then around the South Capitol grounds to 1st Street East, and finally on to East Capitol Street. For 11 more blocks, the bands and marchers and carriages passed throngs of people until they reached 11th Street at the edge of fields and in an emerging residential square. The setting, which is today known as Lincoln Park. The setting was much better than the one would have been on the Washington Mall, of course, which was still a kind of swampy and unhealthy dump. What awaited the parade was a festive crowd and a tall statue draped and concealed in flags and bunting. Next to the monument, a stage and large speaker stand awaited a distinguished array of guests. President Ulysses S. Grant, now nearing the end of his second term, arrived before the parade reached the park and was accompanied by U.S. senators, including Oliver Morton, George Boutwell, John Sherman, Blanche K. Bruce, the black senator from Mississippi, and others, members of the President's cabinet, the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, many members of the House of Representatives, and a large contingent of other government officials, as well as some Union generals. This was an amazing audience. Near the platform, the Marine Band struck up Hail Columbia as the speakers walked from their carriages, and the hundreds and hundreds of marchers found their places in a vast audience. As the ceremony began, Bishop John Brown of the AME Church delivered an invocation, and J. Henri Birch of Louisiana read the Emancipation Proclamation. At the conclusion of the reading, the band played Les Marseillaises. Langston introduced James E. Yeatman, a St. Louis banker and head of the Western Sanitary Commission, the organization that had led the fundraising among former slaves and black Civil War veterans, mostly from Missouri, who provided the nearly $20,000 to pay for this monument. Yeatman explained how a former slave woman, Charlotte Scott, had donated the first $5, and how the commission had sought the American sculptor, Thomas Ball, who then resided in Italy, to conceive and create this statue. This remarkable monument, the Freedmen's Memorial, as it would become known and still is known, was many years in the making. It was the result of various designs and changes in purpose and in meaning. In Yeatman's lengthy remarks, he told of the artist Ball's labor of love, he said, his tribute to American patriotism through the gratitude of the freed people. In a smoothed-over, triumphal narrative, Yeatman described the process by which Ball sent 4 photographs of his original model of a standing Lincoln and a kneeling slave to the Sanitary Commission, which in turn sent him a photograph of a former fugitive slave named Archer Alexander, who became the actual person the sculptor depicted, with a muscular torso, looking upward, his fist clenched, and in part, at least, breaking his own chains under the president's guiding arm. Since Ball had been convinced by the commission and by the image of Alexander to alter his conception from a kneeling slave represented as perfectly passive to an emancipated slave, agent of his own deliverance, as he came to say, Yeatman concluded that the monument was, in his words, an ideal group converted into the literal truth of history. Oh dear. Such a ceremonial day in the spring sunshine, surrounded by the highest officials of the federal government, at a monument unveiling unlike any other that had occurred in America, was hardly an occasion for literal truth, whether in bronze or in words. But through all the pageantry would waft some powerful symbolic truths in unforgettable language. Langston stepped to the podium and asked President Grant to come forward to formally pull the cord and unveil the monument. And as Grant stood still for a long moment, as it says in the press, the entire crowd went hushed in rapt silence. And as the flags and draperies fell away, the throng broke into loud applause and shouts. Cannon were fired nearby in a field, and the band struck up "Hail to the Chief." Those up close could see that on the base of the monument was the word emancipation, cut in large letters in the stone. Langston next read 2 congratulatory letters from people who had played roles in bringing about the monument. A poem entitled Lincoln, written by a young black Washington poet named Cordelia Ray, was performed. Then, as parts of the crowd had settled into their chairs and others felt the spring breezes over their heads, Langston introduced Douglass, orator of the day. Along with Langston and many other black leaders, Douglass had strongly supported various efforts to build a major Lincoln and Emancipation monument since at least 1865. That month, he had called for a humble memorial that would, in his words, express one of the holiest sentiments of the human heart. Such a remark came in the context of the immediate post-Civil War period, when many white sponsors of such a Lincoln monument openly called for blacks to prove, as they would say, that they could demonstrate gratitude for their liberation. Douglass had never been one to believe he had to prove his gratitude or his dignity or even his acumen to white people. He had long understood that a national monument to Lincoln would be a major civic undertaking as well as a statement about the place of black people in this country. And from his own visceral experience as a slave and a fugitive slave who plotted his own escape, he fully understood just how much freedom for black Americans was both seized but also given. Douglass had long favored what he called a people's monument without distinction of color, a tribute that would reflect the story of interracial abolitionism, is what he preferred, one that he believed had helped bring Lincoln to the Emancipation Proclamation as well as to the new, potentially reimagined nation of 1865, devoted to a future, as Douglass put it, of common rights and common equality before law. But as he rose to speak in April of 1876 to finally dedicate such a monument, Douglass, who was the recognized voice of black America by this point in time, had prepared a speech of remarkable honesty, poignancy, and present-minded historical insight. Those sitting especially up front among all those dignitaries, I'm almost certain, did not get the speech they thought they probably would. First things are always interesting, Douglass declared, and this is one of our first things. It is the first time, I'm still quoting him, that in this form and manner we have sought to do honor to an American great man. Douglass made it clear that he spoke, at least at first, only as an African American for his race. The event was a first for a second reason that Douglass did not mention. Black people had never before been represented on anything resembling a national monument. In this charged atmosphere of artistic and political firsts, on the eve of the nation's centennial, and amid the deeply disturbing decline and violent overthrow of Reconstruction in the South, Douglass struck notes both majestic and somber. His speech assumed the tone of a requiem, tempered by modest celebration, restrained nationalism, and some redemptive hope. African Americans had tenuously arrived finally and openly in the center of the country's highest affairs. And man, he wasn't going to miss this moment. Douglass made it clear that the unveiling of this monument, which you're looking at, to Lincoln and Emancipation was, as he called it, a national act, performed by citizens in the place where, quote, every pulsation of the national heart can be heard, felt, and reciprocated. He insisted on an initial history lesson, referring to what he called the vast and wonderful change in our condition, meaning black freedom. No such open commemoration by blacks in Washington would have ever been tolerated, he said, before the Civil War's transformations, without opening, as he put it, the floodgates of wrath and violence. Douglass congratulated all, white and black, famous and ordinary, on this contrast between then and now, as he put it. The orator conditioned his audience for the harder truths and the starker metaphors to come by letting them feel the long, dark history, as he put it, of slavery as a matter of the past, replaced now by liberty, progress, and enlightenment. No African American speaker had ever faced this kind of captive audience, composed of all of the leadership of the United States government in one place. And no such speaker ever would again, until Barack Obama was inaugurated president in January of 2009. No black speaker ever had the President of the Supreme Court and the members of Congress in one place as his captive audience at the same time. And Douglass, a master ironist about his beloved America, did not miss this moment of supreme symbolism. It was as though he said, "All right, you invited me today? Let's have at it." He named each contingent of every branch of the government sitting before him, including President Grant, Chief Justice Morrison Waite, senators and representatives, cabinet officials, all acknowledged, he said, as wise and patriotic men. In this moment, the government was something sacred and enduring, newly remade from recent near destruction, the protector of a reconsecrated freedom for whites and blacks. The high officials may have smiled and felt their chests swell a bit as the former slaves' patriotic language, Douglass struck chords of civil religion as he described the stately pillars and majestic dome of the Capitol and the district's foliage and flowers of spring as what he called our church. In this new America, said Douglass, all races, colors, and conditions of men composed our congregation. We the colored people, proclaimed Douglass, rejoicing in our blood-bought freedom, now brought the same experience and sentiment, was his word, like all other Americans. And he said, we are all here as members of, or as brothers of those who filled yonder heights of Arlington. For the first time in the history of our people, Douglass proudly announced, and in the history of the whole American people, we join in the nation's high worship. Then Douglass turned to the memory of Lincoln, and the speech assumed a very different tone. While claiming a place for his people and honoring the martyred president, Douglass suddenly used words that may have shocked some in his audience. It must be admitted, said Douglass, truth compels me to admit, even here in the presence of the monument we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not either our man or our model. In his interest, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. Douglass must have caused some squirming in the chairs as he injected race into, so forthrightly into this rhetorical tribute. It was as though he had decided to give voice to the kneeling slave on the statue, who would now say thank you, as well as speak some bitter truths about a real history, and not merely allow the occasion to be one of proud national self-congratulation. It was as though Douglass was saying, you gave me this unique platform today, and I will therefore teach these lessons about the complex, jagged, and tragic paths by which black people had achieved freedom in the agony of war. He, said Douglass, meaning Lincoln, was preeminently the white man's president. And as he continued in that baritone voice of his, he said Lincoln was entirely devoted to the welfare of the white man. He was ready and willing, I'm still quoting, at any time during the first years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity in the colored people to promote the welfare of the white people of the country. Douglass employed a stunning level of honesty and directness for such a ceremonial occasion. This was supposed to be a ceremonial unveiling, after all. He didn't merely turn his moment in the national sun into a reminiscence about a good war and a glorious outcome. Lincoln's growth to greatness and to the role of emancipator, Douglass insisted, must first be seen through the disappointments of his first year in office. Douglass would not consider the triumphal memory of 1865 without first pulling his audience through the pain of 1861. During the Secession crisis and into 1862, he remembered, Lincoln had promised to support all constitutional guarantees protecting slavery in the southern states. He was, quote, willing to pursue, recapture, and send back the fugitive slave to his master, a position Douglass had utterly condemned during the war. The former abolitionist forgot nothing of Lincoln's record on race and slavery, even in this ceremony, especially the episode in 1862, when in a meeting with 5 black ministers in the White House, the president, as Douglass puts it, strangely told us that we were to leave the land in which we were born, or when he told us he would save the Union with slavery and refuse to retaliate our murder and torture as colored soldiers. This was tough stuff. The litany of Lincoln's sins against the cause of abolition was long and ugly, especially for such an occasion. Then came the most striking and lasting words of the speech. The race to which we belong, says Douglass, were not the special objects of Lincoln's consideration. My white fellow citizens, Douglass declared to the ages, you are children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by forces of circumstances and necessity. But one of those stepchildren was lecturing the nation and its leaders on a beautiful April day. To you, he told the whites in the audience, belonged the prime responsibility in honoring Lincoln. Then he implored them to let the stepchildren have their place in the commemoration. Despise not, he said, the humble offering we this day unveil. For while Abraham Lincoln saved for you a country, he delivered us from bondage, according to Jefferson, 1 hour of which was worse than ages of oppression your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose. Ingenious little move of getting Jefferson into it. Although blacks' faith in Lincoln had been sorely tested, and he had tarried long in the mountain, Douglass found a middle way, a historically balanced remembrance of Lincoln in this new moment of national trial at the end of Reconstruction. Through a comprehensive view, said Douglass, as the speech began to move toward an end, in the stern logic of events and in view of the divinity that shapes our ends, blacks, despite grief and bewilderment at the president's slow actions, concluded, quote, that the hour and the man of our redemption had somehow met in the person of Lincoln. In Douglass's analysis, historical circumstance had made Lincoln the head of a great movement in the end. Most important, Douglass used a refrain, and he uses it over and over in the last parts of the speech. He used a refrain that formed the argument, really, of his speech. Under his rule, he repeatedly declared, under his rule, Lincoln's rule, all manner of great change came about. Slaves were lifted from bondage to self-aware liberty. Black men exchanged rags for Union soldiers' uniforms. 200,000 marched in the cause. The Black Republic of Haiti was recognized. The domestic slave trade was abolished, and a slave trader was hanged as a pirate and a murderer. And the Confederate States, in Douglass's words, based upon the idea that our race must be slaves, was battered to pieces and scattered to the four winds. And under his rule, says Douglass, the immortal paper, meaning the Emancipation Proclamation, emerged, making slavery forever impossible in the United States. Douglass had named the pain and the betrayal of ages in front of the highest officials in the land. Now he entered the celebration. He remembered poignantly his own special experience of Emancipation Night, January 1, 1863 in Boston. I'll come back to that briefly in a little bit. He acknowledged that Lincoln had to work toward emancipation against virulently racist opposition, and therefore had to find the delicate method and the timing for such a revolution. He recognized how deeply intertwined union and emancipation had become, and not least because of Lincoln's brilliant political statesmanship, which he acknowledges. Hence, said Douglass, viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him from the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, determined. As the mature political activist and writer, observer of world historical transformations and betrayals, Douglass had learned much about both the burden and the uses of ambivalence. In the rhetorical twists and turns of this complex speech, Douglass had one overriding target: the declension and the betrayal of Reconstruction in the South by the federal government. That's what the speech is really about. Under his rule and in due time, said Douglass, was his way of saying not simply that Lincoln had personally saved and reimagined the Union as well as liberated the slaves, but that the entire nation had done so and carried the burden of responsibility to do something about it now. That black freedom and the fate of the Civil War constitutional amendments, the civic lives and personal survival of the freed people, were on the line in the South at that very moment, 1876, and that Grant and the government had to be called to action. That was Douglass's subject. And by the way, I have looked high and low to try to find one shred of evidence about Grant's response to this, and there's just nothing in the record. What did Grant think when he was being lectured like this by Frederick Douglass? I wish I knew. Did he go back to the White House and just pop a cork and say, boy, that guy had a bee in his cap today? By 1876, a pivotal general election year and the nation's centennial celebration, only 3 southern states remained unredeemed by the white counter-revolution against Reconstruction. Each of them, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, had Republican-controlled regimes teetering on the brink of political extinction at the hands of terror and murder and election fraud, organized in the service of the Democratic Party and of white supremacy. Indeed, the White South's revival and takeover of its political fate and the systematic destruction of black civil and political rights, as well as economic independence, had left a despairing cloud over what remained of any Reconstruction policy by the Grant administration. Worst of all, the experiment in racial democracy born of emancipation and the remaking of the Constitution, the dream come true in 1865, and the legacy Douglass had for more than 10 years trumpeted in the long-term hope of his people, not only lay in tatters, it had been crushed by widespread and unpunished violence. Many hundreds murdered trying to vote or establish livelihoods, thousands more tortured or intimidated away from practicing their political rights, and ballot boxes stuffed and stolen. This was the sorrowful state of American democracy in that beautiful spring of 1876. Each note of either cautionary woe or modest celebration in Douglass's dedication speech at the monument, with Lincoln standing majestically over the kneeling, subservient former slave, needs to be considered through this story of the fateful defeat of Reconstruction. At one and the same time, the speech was Douglass's careful statement of the great growth and change that Lincoln presided over during the Revolutionary War years, and a lament over the apparent success of the counter-revolution against it. As he concluded, Douglass gave his audience a thoroughly mythic Lincoln, a gift from the freed slaves to the nation's best sense of itself, despite all the terror emanating from the South. He brought the Illinoisan into the community of freedmen, The president had been, said Douglass, a man of work, a son of toil, the plebeian, he calls him, an honest boatman whose moral training came from his labor. He made Lincoln a laborer. And on this anniversary of the assassination, Douglass culled that national nightmare for all its redemptive symbolism, as well as power in the politics of memory. Lincoln's murder, he declared, was not only the hell-black revenge of Confederate agents, but, quoting him, the crowning crime of slavery itself. As Reconstruction fell to new hell-black actions by ex-Confederates, Douglass spoke to and for the black people who had planned and provided this event. This was a good work for our race today, he announced, fastening ourselves to a name immortal and defending ourselves against all who would scourge us from the range of human brotherhood. Douglass's Freedmen's Memorial Address was the tortured effort of a national stepchild to find the words that might still make the high and mighty of the United States hold the remaining lifeline to his people. It was an extraordinary first thing he dearly hoped would not be a last thing. I wanted to inflict that on you, partly because it's the opening 10 pages of my new biography, and I hadn't done that before, so you're the guinea pigs. Now, you all know this monument, I suppose. If you haven't, go up and see it in person. Very controversial over the years for hosts of reasons I don't want to go into at this point. These are 3 images of Douglass that very year, 3 different images. This one taken in Washington, D.C., this one taken in Chicago. This is Douglass now with the full white mane. Imagine being out there in Lincoln Park that day and seeing this man give that speech. Well, let's go back a lot earlier now. Now, all I want to do now is take you back to the war. This is the very young Douglass, of course. Actually, let me take you up to the war years. I have to admit, I was it last spring, actually it was a year ago this month, I was invited to the Museum of the Confederacy, which is a wonderful research institution, but they're doing a series of programs for the Civil War sesquicentennial where they bring in 4 or 5 historians each April, and each of those historians is to make the case for one person in the Civil War for that year. So I was 1862. This year would be 1863. They pick 5 names, 5 people in the Civil War years, and you have to make the case that that is the person of the year. You know, like Time Magazine. And so I was to do Douglass. Now, I'll grant you, this was for the Museum of the Confederacy. And the people who run it are actually good friends of mine, and I knew I wasn't being completely thrown to the wolves. But when I was up against Robert E. Lee, and I mean, forget it. I mean, Emory Thomas, whom I love. If you know Emory Thomas as a historian and a speaker, I'll go hear Emory Thomas, just mumble, and it's beautiful. Emory did Lee, and by the way, at the end, the audience, there were like 300 people, vote. They voted. I got Douglass 3rd place. Behind Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And I'm completely convinced I got him 3rd place because I showed 3 or 4 of these. I got the women's vote. I had women coming up to me afterward and saying, "My husband didn't vote for him, but I voted for him." I mean, come on. Now, this is a photograph. It's housed at a museum in Kansas City. I'm forgetting the name of the museum, forgive me. This is being streamed, so I blew that. But this has never been published, never been used. And my friend Zoe Trott, who helped me put together these photos and is one of those 3 people creating the new book on Douglass's photographs, found this out in Kansas City. I'm using this on the cover of a new edition of Douglass's My Bondage and My Freedom, his second autobiography. But stunning profile. We'll get him to the war years here. Getting angrier. Now there's several photos of Douglass during the war years. I just want to do this. I want to talk briefly about Douglass's response to secession, and then just briefly about Douglass as a war propagandist, and then just briefly take us to indeed where he was on Emancipation Night. Douglass and secession is a fascinating subject because, you know, in history it's very easy for us to look back and we know everything that's coming, and we don't stop very long on some elements of the past because we hurry on to something more dramatic. Douglass was very confused, tormented, really torn during the secession winter, 60-61. When the South seceded from the Union, well, the 7 states of the Deep South seceded from the Union, on the one hand, it was Douglass's fondest dream. His fondest dream was for the South to do something crazy enough that would somehow force the federal government into some kind of sanctioned military action against us. Imagine if that would ever occur, a sanctioned military action against the South by the federal government. That was his fondest dream. And secession now seemed to make that possible, although during the secession winter, of course, abolitionists became very unpopular. And he was nearly beaten to a pulp in a rumble in Tremont Temple in Boston in December of 1860. During the secession winter, he's not locked into any Republican Party networks. He's not in the know. He doesn't know many Republicans. He certainly knows no one in Abraham Lincoln's circle. He does not know what Lincoln is thinking. And by February and by March, by the time Lincoln is inaugurated, Douglass is convinced there will be a new grand compromise, big compromise. Grand bargain, we call them today. I guess we need to bring back Henry Clay or something. But he was convinced there was going to be another compromise of 1861. He didn't quite know. I mean, then there were all kinds of machinations, of course, we know this, going on in Washington between Southerners, and all kinds of plans and proposals were all over the place for compromise. That none of them actually ever got complete traction was actually a surprise to Douglass. He was so in despair that here at this moment, this opening, the possibility now of something being done in a sanctioned way against slavery in the South, but it looked like it was all going to fizzle. And he was in such despair that he listened to his daughter, Rosetta, who's now in her early 20s. She, it appears, convinced him to book a passage to Haiti to check it out. Douglass had always been completely opposed to colonization schemes, immigration plans. There had been a lot of black immigration plans, especially in the late 1850s. Douglass resisted all of them. He said over and over and over, this is the land of our birth. We have the birthright of all other Americans. There is no point in emigrating abroad. He actually booked passage to go have a look at Haiti as the possible site of his own immigration. And then came the firing on Fort Sumter. And he writes that little editorial in this newspaper, passage to Haiti canceled. But Douglass was still troubled, to say the least. And he becomes now a thumping, aggressive, about as brutal and vicious a war propagandist as the North ever had. Find any newspaper editor, from Horace Greeley of the New York Herald Tribune to the smallest little newspaper in Beloit, Wisconsin, or wherever you want to look. You won't find a more aggressive, more vicious war propagandist than Frederick Douglass. But before we even get to just an example of that, Douglass, in his usual way, as he was doing there in the Freedmen's, or as he will do in the Freedmen's Memorial speech much later, found his way of explaining what he thinks should happen, or what has happened, in metaphor. He wrote an editorial in April 1861 in his newspaper entitled, "Who Killed the American Eagle?" Following. "The great American eagle is dead," said Douglass. "His power is gone forever." He then offered this kind of metaphorical explanation for why the eagle has died. "By an old argument," he says, "between Mr. South and Mr. North, the eagle was to be raffled off between the contracting parties every 4 years, and whichever got the highest number was to take the bird for the next 4 years. For many years, Mr. South was regularly, or had regularly won the eagle and enjoyed its services. He had trained it to hunt slaves, to protect slave traders, to steal from Mexico, to tear the flesh of offensive strangers, to guard, protect, and extend slavery. Mr. North, however, had always," says Douglass, "had always coveted this bird of prey, and he now determined that if he should ever get possession of the eagle, he would teach him better manners and train him to better habits. At last, in 1860, says Douglass, Mr. North won the eagle. But before handing it over, as in honor bound, the treacherous Mr. South filled the unsuspecting bird with a heavy dose of secession powder, so that our once majestic bird was as good as dead." Now, Douglass went on. "Why has the eagle died?" he asked. And his answer, "Because the bird must die, and the verdict of the inquest must be that it died of poison, treacherously administered at the instigation of Mr. South by one James Buchanan, Democrat, tool and puppet of the white South." A lot of truth to that. Now, one could go on, but what you have there in that homely kind of metaphor about a bird is basically Douglass's conception of history and conception of the meaning of the coming of the Civil War and how and for what it ought to be fought. Douglass wanted a destruction of the first American Union and the recreation of a second one through emancipation. Quite remarkably, that is what he will get. Now, a quick word about Douglass as a war propagandist. In my first book, 20-some years ago, which was a dissertation, I have an entire chapter. That book was about Douglass's Civil War, his interpretation of the Civil War. I have an entire chapter on Douglass as a war propagandist. If you ever go look at it, or if you read any of Douglass's editorials and many of his speeches during the war years, you'll find some extraordinarily vicious rhetoric. What he was really doing from 1861 on to the end of the war was creating a hated enemy. He was creating a horrible Hun, and that horrible Hun was slaveholders. He argued over and over and over again that slaveholders ought to be dehumanized and they ought to be slaughtered because they deserve to be. It's not pretty. It's not nice. It may not be that Douglass of love that Robert Hayden remembers in one of those lines in that beautiful poem. This is not Douglass of love. This is the Douglass of hatred. How does one understand that in Douglass? In the new biography, what I'm going to argue, and I haven't quite written those chapters yet, so I'm not sure precisely how, but the only way to understand that rage in Douglass, that hatred, and he uses the word hatred explicitly, boldly, over and over and over. He says what Northerners need is the spirit of a deadly hate. The only way to really grasp it is to go back and try to understand where it came from in himself. And Douglass, the war propagandist, is born on the Eastern Shore in his youth as a slave to really understand what comes out of Douglass once the Civil War comes. And he feels now this kind of official sanction of creating the hated enemy out of slaveholders. If you look back to the way he has depicted earlier his year on the Covey farm, his relationship with Thomas Auld, his owner, the way he was viciously tortured and beaten by Covey. Most importantly, the way he felt he was psychologically tortured by all of his masters and all of his owners. You begin to realize he's not just a war propagandist because it's now the thing to do if you're a newspaper editor. It's very real for him. And one of the best ways to see it is to go look at his famous broadside, Men of Color to Arms, which is always depicted, and it should be in some ways, as a great patriotic document. This is in the spring of 1863 when Douglass goes out to start recruiting black soldiers, the first two of whom were his own two sons. He produces this famous broadside, Men of Color to Arms. But if you look through it down in the middle, he invites them to engage in personal, violent retribution. Go kill slaveholders. Here's your chance. On the night of emancipation, Douglass was in Boston. He even remembered that in the Freedmen's Memorial speech. You can move him. Here he is, 1863. The white hair is beginning to happen. I don't know of any evidence that he helped it happen, but he certainly helped his hair a lot of times, no doubt. He was in Boston at Tremont Temple. Now, a quick little word or two of context. This is an easy event to depict because it is so dramatic. Tremont Temple in Boston, 3,000 people in that beautiful old, what is now an old Baptist church. And it all seemed sort of inevitable, right? Emancipation Day finally came and they had this glorious celebration and Douglass leads it. But leading up to that for months, of course, was a very different process. The preliminary proclamation is announced in September. Just before that, Douglass had written his most vicious words about Abraham Lincoln that he ever wrote. Douglass had called Lincoln the year before the most powerful slave catcher in America. And by August of 1862, he was outraged at Lincoln when Lincoln held that meeting with 5 hand-picked black ministers from around Washington, D.C. at the White House, where Lincoln invited these black ministers to lead colonization plans out of the country, where he blamed the war on black people, where he said there is no future for blacks and whites together in the United States. Without your people's presence in this country, we would not have this great war. It was Lincoln's worst racial moment. Douglass went ballistic in an editorial when he read the transcript of that meeting back in Rochester. And suddenly, 3 weeks later, comes the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which we now know, of course, Lincoln had had in his pocket or in a drawer for 3 months. Douglass was greatly encouraged by the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Cautious, but greatly encouraged. But there was 100 days, of course, between the preliminary and the final proclamation. Would he sign it? Would he sign it? Would it really happen? Could this really be true? Could the dreams of centuries actually happen? And there was a Douglass had a lot of confidence that it was clearly going to happen until that State of the Union or that annual message by Lincoln in December. Lincoln was always a give with one hand and then take with the other a little. But Lincoln, of course, was taking his own tortured, legal, constitutional, moral, and political path to get to this moment. But there's a long passage in Lincoln's December 1862 annual message, again, calling for the colonization of black people out of the country. And Douglass again thinks, my God, can't this man ever quite get it down? Just tell us what you're going to do. But evidence that he had real confidence is simply this, and I just figured this out recently. The editorial that Douglass published in his newspaper after the Emancipation Proclamation is called A Day for Poetry and Song. It's published in January, after the event. I always had this, I always understood he went home from this celebration in a misty moment and he wrote this editorial called A Day for Poetry and Song. He wrote it before he left Rochester. He had it already written. He had it already ready. Well, hoping, assuming Lincoln would sign it, it would happen. At Tremont Temple that night in Boston, New Year's Day, they waited all day. Maybe you've read this story before or heard this story before. 3,000 people. People are milling in and out all day long. Lots of abolitionists. Boston was in that hall that day. It was largely led by blacks. In that case, there was another celebration largely led by whites, by Garrison and others. And Garrison and Douglass in these years were rarely in the same space at the same time. They weren't getting along for lots of reasons. And then the day wore on, and it wore on. No news came, and they had a line of runners off to the telegraph office from Tremont Temple. And no news came. People got worried. They got troubled. Maybe he wasn't going to do it. There had been all these rumors. Lincoln wouldn't sign it. 6 p.m. came, 7 p.m. came, 8 p.m. came. Still no news. 9 p.m. came. People are making speeches all day long. Douglass had made more than his share, which is the usual thing. Platitudes. Finally, despondency is setting in by about 10 p.m. And then finally some guy runs in the door and has some piece of paper in his hands. It's on the wires. He signed it. It's on the wires. It's on the wires. It's on the wires. And they brought some document up to Douglass and others, and somebody started to try to read what was coming over the wires about the Emancipation Proclamation, but nobody wanted to hear whatever the words were. Nobody wanted to know what the document said. They just wanted to celebrate. Douglass got control of the raucous crowd, finally, and he led them in one of his favorite hymns, Blow Ye the Trumpet Blow. And then an old black preacher named Rue led the throng and sound the loud timbrel over Egypt's dark sea. Jehovah has triumphed, his people are free. And they partied, and they shouted, and they cried, and they hugged, and they danced until about midnight, and they had to leave the hall because they'd only rented it till midnight, and they were thrown out. And they regathered at the 12th Street Baptist Church, Leonard Grimes's church, a black church, and there they did indeed have some kind of celebration and party all night long. Douglass remembered walking out at dawn on a probably cold and snowy January morning after all night at the black church. But 18 years later, in Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, his third autobiography, he left this remembrance of that moment, and I think it captures something. It was not logic, said Douglass, but the trump of Jubilee, which everybody wanted to hear. We were waiting and listening as for a bolt from the sky, which should rend the fetters of 4 millions of slaves. We were watching, as it were, by the dim light of stars, for the dawn of a new day. We were longing for the answer to the agonizing prayers of centuries, remembering those in bonds as bound with them. We wanted to join in the shout for freedom and in the anthem of the redeemed. Now, it was a long time, of course, before this anthem would be truly redemptive. And there was 1863 and 64 and 65 to come. And as you probably know, his first two recruits are his own two sons. Actually, all three of his sons ended up in the service. The third one, Frederick Jr., ended up a recruiter of black troops down in the Mississippi Valley. Lewis and Charles, Lewis at 21, Charles at 20 years old, went into the 54th Massachusetts. There are some letters between father and sons when they're at the front. Some. Douglass never says a word. Well, there's a sentence or two about recruiting his sons into the army, but there's so precious little about what went on between father and sons. What does a father say to his sons when he recruits them into the army, especially in a war? If the sons are captured, they will either be killed or re-enslaved or enslaved as black men? What does he say to his two sons who were born free in the North? Did he send them to war for their reasons, or did he send them to war for his reasons? We don't fully know. A biographer has to kind of work his way into that relationship. I do know this. When the 54th Massachusetts famously marched through Boston in late May of 1863, before huge crowds, when they marched down Beacon Street, off to the war, the great symbolic test regiment as they were, with Robert Gould Shaw out on horseback in front of them, they went by Shaw's house on Beacon Street. That house and that balcony are still there if you want to go see. And on that balcony were none other than Governor Andrew of Massachusetts, whose spirit really brought about that regiment, Shaw's parents, William Lloyd Garrison, Douglass, and others. And Douglass tells us that Garrison stood with his hand on a bust of John Brown. Can you believe that? Why not? What I do know is that when the regiment marched by, and Douglass probably waved, or maybe he saluted his sons, he went out the back door, he got in a carriage, he went out to the wharf, he got on the boat with them, he rowed the boat with his two sons to the last point of Boston Harbor where they could put him in a dinghy or a rowboat of some kind and get him back to shore. It's as though Douglass wanted to hold on to his sons to the last minute. Now, the press said he went out there just to sort of bless the soldiers as they left. Don't know. I think he went to probably hug his sons one last time. Anyway, I'll take you through a few more. There are so many great photos of Douglass. These are all during the war years. 64, again 64. Douglass during Reconstruction, the hair going white. This one taken in Illinois. He would sit for photographers wherever he went. 1873, 1880. What is he doing with that hair? That's a famous one that's been used over and over. This is Douglass in Haiti. When he's U.S. Minister to Haiti. Douglass the year before he died, 1894, a little portly. He kept speaking and doing speaking tours, by the way, to almost the bitter end. No one will ever truly count the number of speeches on the road. I'm convinced of that. Now, no one's ever going to come up with a true count of the thousands and thousands of times Douglass spoke out on the road. Finally, May of 94, this is only about 10 months before he died. Now, I just want to show a few artist depictions here in the 20th century. Bring us back to this relationship he had with Lincoln, and I'll close with this. Again, I'm at the great debt here of my friends, the art historians Zoe Trott, John Stauffer, and Celeste Bernier, who are collecting these. Turns out there are hundreds of artistic images of Douglass in the 20th century. It seems everybody had to depict him at one point or another. This is Hale Woodruff. Hale Woodruff's an African-American artist born in Illinois. He studied mural painting with Diego Rivera. And he competed with this very image for the artwork that went up as a mural in the Recorder of Deeds building here in Washington. I've never been in that building, and I'd love to go find it. He didn't win the commission, however. This is one of many depictions of the Emancipation Proclamation being debated and signed that just artists would just pluck Douglass into the story. I mean, he should have been there. I mean, he was there, wasn't he? Look at the central role Douglass is given here with the other cabinet officials. We've got Seward and we've got Stanton and others. And there's this one by William Scott, William Scott's an African-American artist from Indianapolis. He is the artist who actually got the commission for the Recorder of Deeds building, and this is the piece that was put up there. Is it still there? Do we know? I don't honestly know. Is the Recorder of Deeds building still there? I don't even know that. Does anyone here know?
There is still that building.
The building is there? Then one would presume that this is still there. Sorry?
It's across from the security floor.
Oh my goodness. But check this one out. Look at Douglass pleading with Lincoln. That would be, I think, Gideon Wells and Salmon Chase. But Lincoln is not looking at Douglass. He's just kind of burdened and looking down at the floor. Like, give me a break, you know. Pen in hand. It appears to be blank paper. Douglass making his appeal. Pretty aggressively, it would seem. And then there's this piece by William Johnson, who was a South Carolinian self-taught artist, folk artist, obviously. He did a series called Fighters for Freedom. This is one of them. The others in the series, I believe, are John Brown, Nat Turner, and Harriet Tubman. But note what's going on here. He apparently put lynching images in many of his paintings. But again, proclamation, open, empty page on the table, Douglass appealing to Lincoln. That same image again. Douglass must have been there. Didn't Lincoln listen to him? Didn't Douglass write the Emancipation Proclamation? And here's a poster from 1951. It says, "Shake Dixie," with a thunder sound. It comes from an organization called Freedom Associates, and it came out of the magazine called Freedom that Paul Robeson edited. And it's interesting how Douglass gets depicted here, looking right at the viewer. He's looking right at us, past Lincoln. Cover of Ebony in September of 1963. I was junior high school then, and I don't have any memory of this at the time. I don't know how people responded. I don't know even how well-known Douglass was. It's hard to chart this in the broader American culture. Clearly, to artists, he is a touchstone. He is a marker. He is an icon who must be visited. Just like the poets, the artists must visit him. Now, 67. By Charles White. Charles White's a very important black artist. He did Douglass in paintings and lithographs and drawings. He was a Chicago artist. I mean, this seems to me, this is the Black Power Douglass. I mean, check him out. I mean, again, Lincoln looking away, Douglass pleading, demanding, Brother Abe, come on. Let's talk. I don't know what's up with the shoes either. But. And this is the last one I'll show. This by Mary Barksdale from 2007. He's a Los Angeles artist, again self-taught. This appeared in The Nation magazine. Accompanying an article by Eric Foner in 2007. We've got Douglass dragging Lincoln on, dragging Abe to the woodshed, it says in the caption. Now, I will say this. I love these artist depictions of this relationship. But would that this relationship had been so tight or so close or so intimate. Would that Douglass had had so many intimate audiences with Lincoln. They only met 3 times, as you may know. 2 of them in the White House. The first in August of 1863 at Douglass's demanding. He just basically went to the White House and got in line and managed to get in and had probably 45 minutes with Lincoln. On that occasion, Douglass went to protest all the discriminations and unequal pay against black soldiers. And he had quit recruiting by then. Douglass quit recruiting on August 1st of 1863. He visits the White House August 10th. He came away saying that it was like in diplomatic speak, that he and Lincoln had a frank discussion. They didn't disagree. They didn't agree on everything. Lincoln apparently according to Douglass, very forthrightly told him, look, you don't have an easy job, but I have one that's even harder. And I know there are discriminations. I know these are terrible discriminations, but this is as far as we can go so far. What Douglass did say after he came away from the first meeting was that he was so impressed with Lincoln, the way Lincoln treated him. He said he'd never been treated by a white man with power so respectfully. The second meeting is a full year later, August 15th of 64, this time at Lincoln's invitation. It's extraordinary. I mean, the brief context is it's the summer of 64. You've got the stalemate in the Overland Campaign in Virginia. You've got terrible war weariness all over the North. Lincoln's now in a re-election campaign and really believes there's at least a 50-50 chance he's going to lose the fall election to George McClellan and the Democrats, who are going to negotiate a peace with the South. And Lincoln invites Douglass as the principal spokesman of Black America, although I think he probably invited him as the principal spokesman of abolitionists, to come to the White House to discuss matters with him. And they met then perhaps as long as an hour. And in this meeting, to Douglass's great surprise, in fact, I think Douglass was utterly stunned by this, among the things Lincoln discussed with Douglass is that he asked Douglass to set up a system of funneling as many slaves out of the Upper South into the North before Election Day as could possibly be accomplished in case he loses the election. Now imagine Douglass is sitting there with Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln's asking him to go out and create a John Brown plan. And by the way, Douglass didn't have a clue how he was going to do this. It was supposed to be in conjunction with the Army. He was asked to go set up a system of agents across the North, and he did. He tried. He went back home. He started firing telegrams and letters. Basically, there were letters to all of his friends, agents who had been recruiting black troops, saying, you're not going to believe what I've been asked to do, but here's what we're asked to do. But of course, it was only 2 weeks later, came the fall of Atlanta, and it was all off. The scheme was dropped. Morale in the North increased measurably almost overnight. There never was a scheme to funnel all those slaves out of the South that Douglass had been asked to create. Lincoln may have been up to a few other things in that meeting for public consumption, particularly on his left, his abolitionist left. Hard to know. And then again, of course, they met at the second inaugural. They met after the second inaugural. Next time you see that famous photograph, or if you see the Lincoln movie where Daniel Day-Lewis is performing the second inaugural, through whichever means you see Lincoln doing the second inaugural, down to his left, I don't know how many rows out, but not too far, Douglass was in the audience. Douglass went to Washington. He wasn't going to miss this. And he tells us afterward that when Lincoln sat down with Andrew Johnson next to him, that he tapped Andrew Johnson on the knee and pointed at Douglass, as though to say, hey, there's Frederick Douglass. At least that's the way Douglass remembered it. And then after the speech, Douglass was determined. He was going to go to the reception at the White House. Didn't have an invitation. Wasn't invited. He walked Pennsylvania Avenue behind the presidential carriage all the way to the White House. Got in line. Begged his way in. He was stopped by the guards and police. He was told no. He was told no. He tells us that he all but ordered or demanded that the guards tell the president Frederick Douglass is out here. 5 minutes later, somebody came back and said, come on in. He went in. He tells the story later. And we have one eyewitness to this. Douglass tells the story later that he goes into the big East room and he sees Lincoln's head up above everybody, and Lincoln sees him, and Lincoln stops talking to whoever he's talking to and comes over to Douglass. And he says, "Mr. Douglass, what did you think of my speech?" And Douglass says, "Oh, Mr. President," he demurred, "Oh, you have many guests, it doesn't matter what I think." And then the president says, no, I want to know what you think. And Douglass tells us that he said, "Mr. President, that was a sacred effort." Now, that was a sacred effort to Douglass because Douglass had basically been dreaming of writing that speech for Lincoln for at least 3 years. That Lincoln gave that speech, though, saying that for every drop of blood shed by the lash, it shall be paid by blood shed with the sword. That Lincoln gave that speech was what was important. I want to end with this. Back to the 20th century and another artist's representation. It may be my favorite of all time. It's a little scene embedded in one page of Ralph Ellison's great novel, Invisible Man. Even if you've read Invisible Man carefully, you may forget this scene. Oh, I hope you don't. But there's a scene where Invisible is sitting in, Invisible who has no name, except Invisible, is sitting in the headquarters of the Brotherhood, the organization for which he works, somewhere there in the 1940s, which we know is some sort of symbol for the Communist Party. Invisible's just sitting there in the office one day, hasn't been given his speaking assignment out somewhere in the city. An old man named Tarp walks in. Tarp clambers up onto a chair and tacks a poster up on the wall. And then Tarp asked Invisible, sitting back in his chair, "Son, do you know who that is?" Well, we got to put him back up here. Sorry. There he is. Tarp says, "Well, do you know who that is?" And Invisible says, "Why, yes, it's Frederick Douglass." "Yes, sir, that's just who it is. But do you know much about him?" "Not much," says Invisible. "My grandfather used to tell me about him, though." "That's enough," says Tarp. "He was a great man. You just take a look at him once in a while." And then Brother Tarp, says Invisible, "Thanks for the portrait of Douglass," as Tarp begins to walk out. And Tarp says, "Don't thank me, son. He belongs to all of us." Well, Invisible's grandfather had been a slave, so he tells us. And as Invisible sits there looking at the poster of Douglass leaning back in his chair, all by himself in a room, he begins to hear the voice of his grandfather saying, "Be more human, be more human." And then Ralph Ellison ends the scene with Invisible facing up at the Douglass portrait, quote, "Feeling a sudden piety, remembering but refusing to hear the echoes of my grandfather's voice." Thank you.